I started working with Parent Voices as a volunteer and a parent leader because I was impacted by a lack of childcare subsidies. We lost our childcare subsidy when my son was 4 years old, and so he was taken out of preschool, and I ended up losing my job because I didn't have any care for him. I think that's an evolving and ongoing process, really understanding that I'm part of a larger movement. I'm always energized when I start talking to people, right? When I start talking to parents and childcare providers and people that are trying experiments and creative ways to solve really complex problems in their states and in their organizations. And I always come away learning so much about what's possible and feeling much more hopeful as a result of connecting with people across the country. And so, you know, movements are not built overnight. However, this is a place where we can get ready when that moment comes, when there's a spark. Not if there's a spark, but when there's a spark, and it's time for us to mobilize and act. This is all of that foundational work and that ground setting for that. My name is Clarissa. I'm the Executive Director of Parent Voices Oakland. We're based in Oakland, California, and I have one son who's 11 years old. So I got very involved. At that time, the Great Recession was happening, and there was a lot of cuts to our state budget, and so I got very active in doing press conferences and actions and going to the Capitol and meeting with legislators to preserve and protect the subsidies that existed and also to advocate for more subsidies for families. So I was personally impacted, and that's what led to me being a part of the organization. I wish the child care system would just be called child care and be based in a supportive network of agencies, well-compensated teachers who are able to provide for their families and then provide quality care for children, where services are localized and there's community autonomy around decision-making, where families feel respected and supported in their full dignity and their decision-making as parents. And also where, of course, there's full resources and funding, but we have a system that is easy to navigate and understand for community. I think one of the important things is we can bring a lot of resources into our system, but if families don't understand how to really navigate it, how to get what they need, how they don't know if services are even available, then it's not helpful. So that's why policymaking really needs to come from the grassroots up, and why we're building a grassroots movement of childcare providers and teachers and parents all coming together so that we can really create a system that is comprehensive and also easy to understand and navigate and utilize for families. Well, I realized this was a larger issue when I moved from being a parent leader into an organizer position with the organization. So I'm one of the first paid staff in our Oakland chapter. We'd had an organizer who recruited me. And I'll never forget this. I was sitting in the waiting room of the childcare agency that administered the subsidy. And she came up to me and started talking to me and did what we call a one-on-one interview and organizing, and invited me to this meeting. And one of the reasons why I went was because, one, I was pretty isolated as a new mother with my son. It was kind of just work, going to different agencies where I was receiving benefits, and going home with my son, and I was pretty lonely. And she said that there was a meeting with free pizza. And so I went to this meeting. She said, there's some other mothers who, you know, have you thought about childcare? And I was already angry that I had such a hard time getting the childcare, which is why it was devastating to lose it. So I was already pretty angry that it was difficult to access the system and that no one was there to explain it. And so I said, yeah, I have some thoughts about that. So I went to this meeting for the pizza, and because there would be other parents there, and I heard that there were experiences like mine in that meeting. And then when I came onto staff as an organizer, I was given this list that was about 5,000 names long. And I was told, well, you know, you can call people from it, but we don't really have anything to offer them. This is the waiting list. The number, these are families that need subsidies, and we don't have anything for them right now. There's not enough resources. So we put them on this list, and as resources become available, we call families off the list. And when I started calling these families, I realized they were primarily African American women, many of them on the brink of homelessness, just as I had been, because they didn't have childcare. And so as I was calling them and organizing them, I started to realize there was a very clear pattern of racism, economic injustice, and discrimination that had largely been invisible. And I knew that this was happening in my city, but it became very quickly, I became aware as I began to travel and talk to other families and other people across the country that this was systemic and that it was widespread. It was an issue. It was a crisis, actually. Well, childcare is the linchpin of our communities, truly. If we're looking at the health and well-being of a community, a neighborhood, a state, a country, we have to look at the health and well-being and the outcomes of our children and our families and how well they're performing or what indicators there are for their success. And I would say that our country is underperforming when you compare to other countries, many other countries that are considered developed countries. And our lack of investment in the social safety net in general speaks to, one, the stigma and the perception that low-income families are struggling because of an individual problem, not because of a systemic problem. And sitting at the heart of that, again, is our history of racism, the exploitation of labor, discrimination of immigrant communities, looking for work opportunities and to, their ability to create well-being for their families, as well as a history of demonizing Black women in particular for being marginalized from economic opportunity. Also, I think there's an element of this that aligns with the reproductive justice movement, a family's right to parent, the health and well-being and the support of Black women, for Black women's health and Black women's bodies. All of that is very tied and connected to the act and the responsibility and the relationship between a caregiver and a child. So at Parent Voices statewide, we really look at the state budget and have focused on, we have a legislative strategy where we either correct systemic issues through legislation at the state level, which is incredibly important, and we partner with a local legal team to do that, called the Child Care Law Center, and they've been incredible partners of ours. We also get engaged in really understanding and training and developing the leadership of parents to advocate for state budget, increase to state funding for childcare and state budgets. So I'll say that again. So we develop the leadership of parents and caregivers to advocate for increases in resources at the state budget level. So we train families to understand how state budgets work. Budgets are really a message about where our values are. Where we put our resources and our money speaks to what we think is important. And so we educate legislators and policymakers and leaders in our capital to really put their values, the values of putting children and families first in front and in the budget process. At the local level, Parent Voices has been critical in building a comprehensive child care ballot initiative that went up in June 2018 in this last election cycle. That was actually a historic moment for the county because for 20 years, there had been advocates and policy advocates and people within our county, which is a large county of 14 cities and 1.6 million people, very large. And for 20 years, there had been people who were experts, seen as experts, trying to explain the importance of brain development and childcare and early education and why it needs to be quality. And Parent Voices came in and we got involved in the county budget process. And we were one of the first groups to really advocate in the county budget process. Again, really understanding how resources are being spent and prioritized and moving those towards early education and childcare, but also highlighting the injustices around housing and gentrification and how that affects primarily low-income communities of color, and how that's connected to child outcomes, and that we can't separate these issues. These are all connected and tied together. The ability to make a living wage, the ability to keep a roof over your head. And so we found that there were families living in their cars, that the infant mortality rate has skyrocketed, that families had less access to health care, and that children, school-age children, were unable to attend school. So we brought all of those issues to our county and brought families who in our organization had been trained and developed as leaders to really speak to those issues and articulate not just the problems that they were experiencing, but the needs and a vision for childcare in connection to these other issues. And so we advocated and won a pilot program that provides emergency childcare and support for families experiencing homelessness. Again, speaking to systemic issues and how complex how complex it is to receive social safety net services. We won navigation, that are parents helping other parents to navigate complex systems. And then that led to some momentum that became political will on the part of our county supervisors, elected officials, to put an initiative on the ballot. And we were part of the policy process every single step of the way. Community, we were able to lift up specific programmatic components that spoke to the experiences of everyday people that were living this, that may not have been prioritized by the experts, the high-paid policy advocates, the lawyers. And we brought our babies to every public hearing. We rallied. We, again, met with elected officials over and over. And so that led to a ballot initiative, again, that would have raised $140 million annually. It was a half-cent sales tax. And it was a big deal because one big part of, especially the workforce in early education, informal care, family, friend, and neighbor providers, which a lot of times is seen as not quality child care. This is a care environment or care situation that is often accessed by families who work irregular work schedules, who are working nights and weekends, who have needs outside of the typical 9-to-5 job. This would have increased their reimbursement and their wages, and it actually acknowledged that this was a workforce that a part of the early education workforce that needed to be developed and supported. So we were really excited about that, in addition to acknowledging that school-age children also need care. We're seeing 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds going home and also staying home at very late hours because there is no care for them. And in the early education system, people tended to think about this only 0 to 5, and so we were able to push for after-school care for children. So it was very exciting. We're going to do it again. We're going to keep fighting.
Sorry, can you pick it up from
Sure.
Very exciting?
Okay, it's very exciting. We're going to fight. It was very exciting. We're going to do it again. We're going to keep fighting. This isn't the end. In fact, we set a boilerplate and a standard for policy making and how we move forward locally as well as at the state level. You know, parents have to be at the table because the way we've been doing this has not worked. What we know about social movements, not just in childcare, is that when the folks that are directly experiencing an injustice, when those are the folks that are leading, the people that are on the front lines, the folks that are living this every day, are making policy and informing policy, and not just having a seat at the table, but actually building power at the table. We own the table. We don't just sit at the table. We see deeper, more meaningful, impactful policy. At the end of the day, parents need to be in leadership because that's how we know our lives will be better. We can't expect someone else to make a policy and create better lives for us on behalf of us. That doesn't work. We know that doesn't work. So parents need to be at the forefront of this movement, in addition to or along with child care providers and folks that are running agencies. And really there is a strong connection between the workers, not just the child care owners, but the workers and the parents working together to ensure that there's better working conditions, better pay, but also that subsidies are more accessible to everybody. There was this amazing panel of movement elders, and I don't think that we get to hear from folks that have been in this fight for 20, 30, 40 years enough to know and remember and be grounded in the fact that we are standing on the shoulders of those that came before us, and that we're not necessarily reinventing or creating the wheel, we are expanding and evolving. And that for me is incredibly helpful and also very healing. This panel, they lifted up that we really need solidarity and that we don't have the privilege to be issue specific. And that is just so important to me in this moment, that if you're working on housing, even if childcare is not your issue, you're standing in solidarity with those fighting for childcare. I mean, that's the only way that we move forward. So that panel and then the table discussions after it that I got to have and really listen to other leaders was really just very helpful and energizing, and gave me a sense of hope and purpose, and just sort of refocused why I'm here and what I'm doing. So, my name is Clarissa. I'm a mother, parent advocate, organizer, and executive director for a nonprofit organization, and I am part of the grassroots movement for childcare. I can just read it. Okay. I'm all, the Grassroots Assembly is an historic, The Grassroots Assembly is The Grassroots Assembly is an historic, nonpartisan convening hosted by more than 30 grassroots groups and advocates representing millions of members. We are moms, dads, teachers, grandparents, nannies, caregivers, and advocates who make up the childcare and early education movement. Together, we are using the power of our collective voices to demand that our leaders take action on childcare and early education. We are building on current momentum. State wins. Wait, was I supposed to keep going? State wins. There's a second part here. I was supposed to do that? Okay.
No, actually, sorry.
Yeah,
I think those are just.
It says state wins, example, local wins, example, and federal support. Okay.
You're.
Childcare.
Childcare and early education.
Childcare and early education.
The movement for childcare.
The movement for childcare.
I am part of the movement for childcare.
I am part of the movement for childcare.
The Grassroots Assembly for Childcare and Early Education.
The Grassroots Assembly for Childcare and Early Education.
Childcare is an intersectional issue.
Childcare is an intersectional issue.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
That was
There you go.